Welcome to episode 95 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. Today's show is another one that highlights an international guest, former UK veteran Andy Price. Andy's story is very similar to that of veterans worldwide, and his experiences led him to start the Veterans Hub, a location where other veterans can gather and talk about how their military service impacted them.
People need to learn to talk about it within their own communities as well. We're very open where we are at the Veterans Hub. We run talks for the local college, we run talks for local businesses. We believe, education is the key to helping people deal with mental health problems and coming to understand it. I'm always saying to people, there isn't a day that goes by where I don't think of something or remember someone or smell something that makes me think of something or hear something that makes me think of an incident that I was in. But what I've come to do is I turn what arguably is a negative back into a positive by, using it to empower me to help others.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to help you understand a little bit more about veteran mental health. As some longtime listeners know, I want to bring on veterans who talk about their own mental health journey, and we got a bit of a unique opportunity today, not just to talk about how U.S. veterans are dealing with the aftermath of combat, but how some of our brothers and sisters in arms internationally are doing that. Again, maybe long-term listeners know that back in episode 3, I had a conversation with UK reporter Matthew Green talking about his experiences and his book Aftershock. And then a little bit in the fall of last year, I got a message from a connection in the UK, John Kennedy, who turned me on to what Andy Price and his team are doing in the UK, not just around Andy's own experience with mental health in the aftermath of combat, but how he's helping other veterans get through what they dealt with. So with very little further ado, I'd like to welcome Andy Price to the show. Andy, welcome.
Yeah, hi Dwayne. Thanks a lot, mate. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, no, I appreciated all the making sure the international connection works. I often, when I talk to veterans from other nations, typically UK, Canada, and Australia, we find that we have something more in common with those in other countries who served in combat than maybe even some of our neighbors who hadn't served. And so I really appreciate having the opportunity to really get a different perspective. And also to see what's common. So before we get into that, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of your background.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, so I joined the Armed Forces, the UK Armed Forces in 2003. I joined a infantry battalion called the Rifles. I stayed with them till 2009. During that time, I did 3 deployments to Afghanistan. So, and I left there primarily because, I think I've become accustomed to being in places like that, and I wasn't really enjoying what came with being in the military back in, let's say, the real world, we would call it, or back in the UK. So I decided to go on to what we call the circuit in the UK, which is the private military world. where for the next few years I worked between Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya. Part of the reason I was doing that was because I was unable to adjust to being in the civilian world. So, well, I'm sure we're going to talk about this later on anyway, but, it kind of becomes, if you've been in them environments, it can almost become a normality for you. Being back in the real world can become the abnormal. I'm a family guy, I've got a partner, we've got 2 children, and that's me.
No, I appreciate that, and very similar, I think, to U.S. veterans. You spent 6 years in, and through those 6 years, multiple deployments to Afghanistan. But a lot of U.S. veterans, we call it contracting work, and so they get out of the military, and then they end up going back as a contractor, like you said, because of the challenges in adapting back to, again, real world or home life. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experiences in Afghanistan. I understand you worked with the Marines for a while.
Yeah, so this is, I worked with your guys basically when I was contracting privately. So I was, for just under 3 years, I was in Helmand working. For 17 months of that, I worked alongside US Marines in it's a place called Musakala, which, if you've been to Afghanistan, is sort of not far from places like Sangin and Nowzad. So it was a bit of a hot spot, I suppose. And I spent 17 months there. It was a good working experience. I've made some good friends with within the US Marine Corps. And I stayed with them for some time, went through a few experiences. I then transferred across to Iraq, where I did approximately about, 2.5 years. I then took a bit of time out for personal reasons. I then went back onto the circuit, ended up in Libya. And last year I finished in that game altogether. But, it was good working with the US Marines, actually, because, the similarities between us all, and not just because of the language, obviously, but, we're all coming from the same background. We're since, the days of sort of World War II, we've always stood kind of side by side with our American counterparts, and, also the Australians and the Kiwis and stuff like that, and the Canadians. And I think, it kind of creates a common bond because we're in one way or another, we're always supporting each other in the same kind of campaigns.
No, that is absolutely true. On my second tour to Afghanistan, we worked closely with the Canadians as they were primarily support for what we were doing. And as you said, it is very much a coalition sort of connection there to be able to what we did in the operations. So once you finished, you got out of the military, and then you were doing your contracting work. I'd like to hear a little bit about the aftermath. What happened when you finally, maybe during that transition out of the military before you hit the circuit, and then what's been going on afterwards? How was the adjustment for you?
Well, look, I made the conscious decision during my last deployment, actually, with the military, that I was going to go and work privately. I felt I'd become accustomed to the infantry side of life, as it were. There is a bit of, when you're looking from the outside in at private contractors, it does look there's a little bit of it looks a tiny bit glamorous, I guess. There's the financial side of it. There's the fact that they're not actually under military control. They appear to be doing a lot more than what we were doing. But there was also the fact that I think I'd started to realise in myself that I was starting to struggle with my own mental health. And I wasn't quite sure how to cope with that. So for me, the natural progression seemed to be, let's go into the private military world. I didn't want to be in the UK, basically. I didn't want to be at home with my family. And when you're working privately, you spend 8 to 9 months of the year away. And that suited me just fine. It was an eye-opening experience. It's a bit more of we call it big boys rules in the UK. So you kind of, the emphasis is on you to do your job correctly and maintain yourself, as opposed to have, say, a section commander telling you what you've got to do and where you've got to be at what time. It's a really interesting experience. Arguably, though, it just added to the problems that were already building up within me. And
you've been really vocal online and through the Veterans Hub, about what those challenges were. From what I understand or what I know about not just mental health support, but medical support, there is no Department of Veterans Affairs in the UK. And so how was it for you trying to adjust to, once you're finally done with everything, to address some of those mental health concerns?
Right, yeah, let me say firstly, I know everything's not perfect across in the States. I know that, and even the Department of Veterans Affairs, I know they have their own issues, but I do wish we had something like that over here. And it is being discussed within the Ministry of Defence and within Parliament at the moment. However, if it does happen, it's going to be a long way off. But yeah, it's kind of support in the UK is not what it should be. We've been involved in conflict especially within the Middle East, after 9/11 and everything like that, and also with the Second Gulf War just before that. We've been involved in conflict now for coming on 2 decades, one way or another. And some of the people that have been in it deploy continuously throughout that time. So that's longer than the 2 world wars put together. And we're coming back, and we're kind of just thrown to the wolves, as it were. We demob. There's no transition period. Transition is usually, from operations to being back in the UK, it's 3 or 4 days. It's called our transition period. And then if you leave the military after you get back, they say there's a 12-month period where you're going to transition or transist out of the military into Civvy Street. But during that time, there's really no guidance as to what it's going to be like to be back in Civvy Street. And there's no follow-up either. So, whatever it is, whether you've got a physical injury or a mental health injury, you go from the military to being passed over to our National Health Service. The National Health Service are undermanned. They're financially they're struggling, and also they have no experience of supporting veterans. So what you find is a lot of the guys either get forgotten about, or they go into the NHS and find that the support is inadequate because people don't know how to deal with veterans, and they just end up falling by the wayside, which is why we have a problem with guys living on the streets. We've got a huge problem with suicide in the UK within the veterans community. It's epidemic, some would say, and it's not a good situation for us to be in. We don't have the patriotism that you guys have towards veterans. When I've come to America, I've seen a distinct difference between how civilians look at veterans over there as to how we're looked at over here. There doesn't seem to be any kind of recognition, and that's not necessarily what we want over here. It's a job we're doing, and we've done our jobs. We don't want pats on the back everywhere we go, and we don't want people cheering everywhere we go. But it would be nice if there was some kind of acknowledgement, from those in a position to make life a bit easier for us, if they did that, in return for what we've done for them.
No, that's a great point, especially seeing it from a U.S. veteran standpoint, and you've heard it before. I'm certain that, we can get kind of uncomfortable, kind of thank you for your service and what all that means. And then I also see veterans, and we saw this especially after Vietnam, for the Vietnam veterans for about 15 years, where not just their service was taken for granted, but it wasn't just acknowledged at all. And it's interesting to hear that that's sort of the way that the non-military population in the UK responds to veterans.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, especially with the organisation I'm running now in the part of the UK that I live in, on the face of it, there is a kind of a underlying respect there and everything like that, and we have seen that locally. But I think there's a lack of education within the public. They didn't really understand the consequences of going into conflict, because there's a kind of economic crisis in the UK anyway. So emphasis that, for the public as a whole, the priority isn't supporting the guys and girls that have been overseas. And if you take me as an example, actually, sort of April time 2017, I had 2018 actually, I think it was. I had quite a substantial breakdown, basically. And during that period, I was unable to do anything for myself, and my partner was trying to get me support. So, you know, she took me to an organisation we have over here called Combat Stress, which is a charity set up and financed by the government to support veterans. And she said, you know, my partner is suicidal. He's made a plan to take his own life if he goes back overseas. He's been diagnosed with PTSD. You know, we need support. And they said, you know, there's a 10-month waiting list, you know, before we can get anyone to see him. So she took me to the local hospital, to the accident and emergency ward, and said, I would like some help with my partner because I feel that he's tried to take his own life. He's a danger to himself and people around him. They turned us away because they said they didn't have the experience or knowledge or manpower to support a veteran going through that. Yeah, and it was just a continuous thing for about a week. We were getting turned away from everywhere because the waiting lists are so long, and also the people don't have the experience to support us. Funnily enough, this is, you know, the whole idea of peer support came from, because during that period there was a US Marine that I was in Helmand with for 7 months. She's a godparent to our youngest daughter, and she actually flew over to spend a couple of weeks with us before she went. She was going to tour Europe for 3 months. She came sort of in the middle of all of that, and she cancelled her tour of Europe to stay with me and my family for 3 months to give us support. And where the health services were lacking and the government was lacking, actually just being able to sit down and talk with someone who had been through them, you know, shared experiences with me overseas, who had been there when I was injured, etc., you know, made a massive difference to me and helped bring me back down, you know, onto this kind of plane that we're on.
You know, the similarities between your experiences, as you had mentioned earlier, yes, everywhere has its own challenges, and much of the similar ones, those individuals who are familiar with and equipped to support veteran mental health, there's such a long wait list. And then there's another group of individuals that you can get in immediately, but they don't understand that veteran culture. And then your experience with the Marine who came over, it boggles my mind that a U.S. vet traveled to the U.K. and gave you better support than you were able to get at home. And that goes to reinforce the idea of those that we served with may be better equipped than those who have never served to be able to provide that support.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, obviously there's things we can't, you know, things we can't do. For instance, I'm not a qualified mental health worker. I'm not a psychiatrist. You know, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that. But there is something to be said for people that have been through the same experiences supporting each other. Sometimes guys and girls don't actually need to sit in a room, a clinical environment, and spill their heart out, you know, to someone who hasn't been there. Sometimes they just need to be part of that brotherhood again and part of that family again, and just be able to, you know, talk freely about their experiences without anyone judging them or you know, mocking what they're saying or not understanding what they're saying. And I think there's something to be said for that.
I absolutely agree. Not every veteran needs to sit in front of a therapist. There's different levels of maybe challenge and discomfort. If we're dealing with something as complex as post-traumatic stress disorder on top of depression and things like that, obviously we want to make sure that someone's safe from, you know, harm of self and others. But there's also, you know, we handle things at the lowest level. I know we did when I was in the Army. I'm certain that you did. And we know that, you know, you deal with things at the lowest level that they need to be dealt. And mental health can really be that as well. And so if all another veteran needs is to sit down and connect with other veterans, that's what the peer support thing is all about. Obviously, you as someone who's interested needs to make sure what you can do and what you can't do. But I get the sense that's really where the Veterans Hub started.
Yeah, that is really. I mean, that came along. Funnily enough, the US Marine I mentioned, and it was my partner came up with the idea of looking around to see if there are other people in our locality going through the same issues. We felt very isolated, which is an absurd thing to think about actually, because you know this is a small country we're in, and the area I live in has a strong history with the military. But yeah, when you're going through a mental health problem, you do feel isolated. And if you're supporting someone with a mental health problem, you feel isolated as well. So we started reaching out to see if there's anyone local. And it turned out, you know, I think on the first drop-in evening I arranged just over a year ago now, where basically I said, come on, let's get a few guys and girls together and maybe we can just have a coffee, have a brew, just talk and just see if we can help each other. We had 15 people turn up on the first evening, all going through similar experiences, all saying the same kind of thing, that there was a lack of support out there, all saying that they missed the sort of the family environment from being in the military, the sort of brotherhood, if you will, and that's worked for us. We very much encourage people to remember what they were doing when they were in the military. We were taught to look after each other, look out for each other, and help each other through things. And we think that's what's missing when you come out. You feel very isolated. You feel like you're not part of that brotherhood anymore. You feel like you're not part of that extended family anymore. So what we encourage guys and girls to do is actually come together and support each other. We're not saying that we understand basically about the finance side of things. We understand that there's an economic crisis on, and we understand that our health services are overstretched. So what we're saying is to take a bit of pressure off of them and don't rely on them so much, and do what you can do to support each other. And then for the areas where you can't do that, then we fall back to them.
So I'm wondering if you were surprised at how that took off with, having those 15 veterans in that first drop in, and I assume there have been more since then. But that's sort of the devil in the isolation, is you feel like you're alone, and then all of a sudden you look up and there's 15 of you who also feel like they're alone, and you realize that you're not.
Yeah, it was. The first evening we ran, my partner said to me, I was incredibly nervous. The anxiety levels were going through the roof, and I found a venue we could use. It was something that I know that has a support organisation for kids with disabilities. He said, go and use my venue in the evening for 2 hours if you want, once a week. So my partner said to me, if no one turns up on the first evening, don't be surprised, because this is in its infancy and we don't really know who's out there. I got down there and there's people queuing up, to come through the door, and it kind of blew my mind, really. And we now support, I would say, we support in excess of 40 veterans locally, in various different ways. We support guys all the way back from the World War II era as well. We support their families. So it's just been a bit of a crazy one this year. It's gone from nothing to something fairly big fairly quickly. The sad fact of it is, though, it's also, despite the fact we've created our own little community here where we live in the UK, the sad fact is there's so many people out there struggling from the veterans community, and it was just a massive eye opener for me. In the first 4 months, we had 3 guys kill themselves in 1 week, and these were. One of them was what we would class as a service user, so he was coming to us for support. The other 2 guys we were aware of. Just in 1 week they all took their own lives, and that's happened time and time again down here as well. So it's just, we do what we can when we can. We can't stop everyone from taking that route, but we try to make a little bit of a difference down here.
No, and even as you're talking, and those veterans who are listening to this are absolutely, again, you're just hitting all of the notes that we're experiencing over here, and the similarities in my mind, to me, what I knew, but they're staggering, right? This is organizations that are providing support to veterans, and then in spite of even some of the support, the suicides continue. Another similarity, and I'm glad that you had brought it up, is you're not just focusing on current era veterans, right? You didn't, the UK didn't have the conflicts, obviously, that we did. But I would imagine, there's Falklands veterans, and then, as you said, World War II. Are you noticing a difference between veterans from generations past to connect to veterans of today?
Yeah, funnily enough, I was speaking to one of the guys from World War II the other day, a guy called Peter Price, same surname as me. And he was saying to me, there isn't a day that goes by where he doesn't think of that conflict, or think of the situations he was in, or think of the guys that he lost. But it was a different era, and they were taught to deal with it differently, I think. There was very much mental health problems weren't accepted at that time in the way they are now. There was no support for these guys and girls, and they very much went on to lead the lives that they led. And arguably there was more suicides back then than what there are now. But it's the same thing. If you speak to someone from World War II, if you speak to someone from the Falklands, they're all saying the same thing. It's the adjustment from being in a situation like that to being back in what we class as being the normal world, the real world. It's the fact they suddenly lose that comradeship, they lose that family. At best case scenario, you've got a small payout financially and you get a medal and that's it. And then you're expected to crack on with your life, when arguably you've been through some of the most traumatic experiences that anyone can experience, throughout a lifetime. And it's just really sad to see how many of these guys from conflicts gone by, have spent, years struggling with their own mental health and just keeping it to themselves because they came from an era where they were taught not to talk about it. And they felt, and because people didn't talk about it, they felt they were the only ones. That's how isolated they felt.
Yeah, if you'll forgive me for perhaps using a British idiom, but the idea of the stiff upper lip, right? That's the we come back, and that's the same thing we experienced with our post World War II generation. I've mentioned it before, where two of my three grandfathers, my modern family, served in World War II or in the World War II era, and none of us knew about it until, at least I didn't know about it until after. I had deployed. And so it was one of those things that generationally, and I think back to this, the World War II veteran, he's got to be in his 90s. The conflict has played over in his mind. We're seeing the same thing with Vietnam veterans. We're 50 years on from Vietnam, and I talk to Vietnam veterans as a clinician who've said there's not been a day gone by over the last 50 years that I haven't thought about what happened in 1968. And as you said, that can be challenging for anybody to bear, but definitely to bear alone.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's first of all, I'll just throw in there quickly. It's worth knowing, especially for your guys over in the States, you might not be aware of this. British forces have been involved in a conflict every single year for the past 100 years, in one shape or form or the other, whether it's just a small deployment or, a large-scale deployment, as what we see in the Gulf and Afghanistan. But I've had this argument with health officials. I've had this argument with the Ministry of Defence up in London. If you're a civilian and you go through one traumatic experience, whatever that may be, and I'm not going to take away from any traumatic experiences because, it's all respected to the individual, but you seem to get a lot of help thrown at you. A loved one dies and, you're offered therapy by the health services. You lose your job. You suffer from a bit of depression, you're offered therapy and maybe you're given some pills to take, to sort of perk you up for a little while. With the stiff upper lip thing, you serve in the military and you are exposed to traumatic events or the threat of, your life coming to an end for months on end. And, you're just told to suck it up and get on with it because that was the job you chose to do. And told to be proud of it, and you're told to, wear your medals with pride when you do parades, and you're just told to get on with that. And that's one of the big arguments I have. What's the difference between a civilian going through one traumatic event and a veteran going through multiple traumatic events? What makes you think we can cope better than a civilian? And it just seems to be an unfair thing. And that's what ends up leading to suicides, people living on the streets, marriage breakdowns, people not being able to work. Guys ended up in prison. There's a large percentage of our prison population is actually veterans, to the point now where they're talking about making veteran-only prisons because we've got that many who are incarcerated at the moment.
Again, very similar. I work with justice-involved veterans through our local courts, and here in my county, in our area, in our local, just the jail itself. On any given day, there's anywhere from 150 to 200 veterans who are incarcerated, either awaiting trial or serving a sentence in the short term, and that's just in the local jail. In our Colorado prison system recently, I visited one of our local penitentiaries, and they've set up an entire veteran cell block, and so there's about 65 veterans who are serving time in this particular prison. And so, again, very similar to what we're seeing in the U.S. and like you said, tragic as well.
Yeah, it is 100%. I think one of the things that leads to these kind of issues within the veterans community as well. It's got to be said. There's a guy we support at the moment. So he was a platoon sergeant with 16 Air Assault, which is an airborne brigade or battalion. He was a platoon sergeant, 15 years. He went on multiple operations. He was in charge of men. He was in charge of thousands and thousands of pounds worth of equipment. He can make life and death decisions. He comes out of the military because he had a breakdown and they felt that he wouldn't be able to continue his career. He's demobilised, comes back into Civvy Street and he's a nobody. Because he's been in the military, it doesn't give you preference for jobs in the UK. So actually he has, because he was, infantry, he doesn't have a skill set that's transferable into Civvy Street. So he can't get a job. He hasn't got a family. He's homeless. He's been in and out of the prison system. And arguably, again, this has been enabled by the military just getting rid of him and expecting him to get on. You can't go from being somebody within a certain environment to being, nobody. And that's one of the things that he struggles with.
And that's one of the things that all of us struggle with. This is you appear to have created your own mission. And I've said it before, I feel as satisfied and now picking up a mission after my 22 years in the Army than arguably I might have done even during some of the time when I was in the Army. But not a lot of veterans are aware that that's even a thing that they can do, create their own space after leaving the military. And sometimes veterans need help to be aware of that and even support to sort of carve their own space.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think whatever role you've had in the military and whatever service you were in the UK, whether it's the RAF or, the Air Force, as you guys call it, or the Navy or the Army or the Marines, we have got, a specialised set of skills. We know how to manage people. We know how to time manage ourselves. We know how to learn new skills. We know how to persevere at them, learning new skills. And I think some of the guys and girls forget that as well. And they just need to be reminded that there are ways that they can use what they've learned to, give themselves a meaningful life after they've left the military. And the other thing is talking about it. People need to learn to talk about it within their own communities as well. We're very open where we are at the Veterans Hub. We run talks for the local college. We run talks for local businesses. So we believe, education is the key to helping people deal with mental health problems and coming to understand it. I'm always saying to people, there isn't a day that goes by where I don't think of something or remember someone or smell something that makes me think of something or hear something that makes me think of an incident that I was in. But what I've come to do is I turn what arguably is a negative back into a positive by, using it to empower me to help others. Does that make sense, Dwayne? I can go on a little bit.
No, absolutely. It does make a lot of sense. It makes so much sense, again, because I hear the same thing. I feel the same thing. It's, again, this isn't for us, like John Rambo having flashbacks and taking over a town. But we're always going to see post-military life through our veteran filter and with our accumulated experiences. Yeah, and so the idea of what we went through impacted us. It's not bad. It didn't make us crazy, but that idea of being able to be able to communicate that to others, that's what you've done with the Veterans Hub.
Yeah, and it's just on that one. It hasn't made. I'm diagnosed with like a complex PTSD, I guess, depression, anxiety. So yes, I do struggle with what I have. I look at it as just being an illness that I have to manage. It hasn't made us crazy. I think it just gives people a different perspective on life. If you've been to the places we've been, it makes you look at life differently. So, with the whole aggression thing that veterans seem to have, people look at veterans and they think they're quick to fire up, they're quick to fight. I don't think really it's a problem about aggression. I think it's because of the places we've been. We just have a lower tolerance of what we see as being bullshit. We know how to get jobs done. We just want to get jobs done. We just want to make sure we do good jobs and that we help we make a difference. So a lot of it's just making the guys, as you said, making people realise what they can and can't do when they come out.
You know, you bring up a very good point, and I see it a lot with veterans who, you know, we see things more globally, right? You know, we just talked about earlier about being exposed to different cultures through coalition forces, the UK and Canadians and Australians and so on. And so we understand things more globally than someone who may have never left America, much less maybe never left their city or their community, other than just like a vacation. And so just that lower tolerance, because we understand, and I don't want to say, you know, things aren't important, but I had a colleague who, and he was previously on the show, who worked with veterans, and then he worked with university students. And he said some of the challenges that he saw with university students were, you know, I'm frustrated because my roommate ate my cheese without asking. And he was like,
listen, that is a frustrating thing.
It is a frustrating thing, but he was like, it's not at the level of some of the complex and repeated things that veterans have seen, and everybody has their own tolerance for challenges, but understanding that this is something that comes along with veterans is, you know, we've seen. Now, and it's not bragging. It's not we've seen things that men should shudder at, but it's actually true. Is we have a different outlook.
It is, and it's not even seeing things that, to paraphrase you there, where you said shudder at. You know, the thing is, whatever people's thoughts and whatever veterans' thoughts on places like Afghanistan, Africa, Iraq, all these different places that in our lifetime we deploy to. Whatever our thoughts on them places, the fact is we've seen another way of life. We've actually seen how people really do struggle and make the best of what they have. You know, where we take things for granted here in the UK, and I'm sure you do in the States, you know, that there is access to schools, to food, water, you know, shops, medical care, everything like that. But we've been to places where, you know, they haven't even heard of the word school. They wouldn't understand education. You know, if they're lucky if they see a doctor once a year or once every 2 years. You know, they have to make rice and whatever they have last for a whole family for a long time. So we've seen a different way of life, and it just puts everything into perspective. You know, it makes you realize what we have.
It certainly does. I'm thinking of when I was in Iraq and we were in Baghdad, and almost it's become cliche when veterans tell these stories, but my camp was in the middle of a dump for the north of the river in Baghdad, and there were people who literally lived in the garbage dump and created their houses out of the refuse that other people threw away. You know, I was in my last deployment was to Mauritania, and we were at a camp outside Kiev, which is a fairly large city in Mauritania. And as you said, you know, you're exposed to what other people don't have, versus in overlays comparatively to what we do have. And that's an eye-opening experience. So it's not just the combat that veterans experience, but it's the exposure that, as you've said a couple times, what we think of the normal world is no longer the normal world. Our deployments become the normal world.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, you know, when I was in Afghanistan, for instance, I used to, it was 9 to 10 weeks away at a time with just under 3 weeks back on my leave. You know, I did that for 3 years. Now, before I'd come home to the UK, I would start suffering anxiety attacks, you know, quite bad ones as well. And, you know, my sleep would go out of sync. You know, I'd start panicking, having minor panic attacks as well. And that's because actually I felt that Afghanistan had become a home for me. Actually coming away from that, coming back to the UK, I felt that was more detrimental to my mental health than being there. You know, I felt more comfortable being overseas, you know, living out of a patrol base or a fob than I did being back here with my family. And I think it does become a way of life.
And I think that's important for people to understand. You know, we talk about in the U.S. a reduced number of individuals are serving in the military, and we call it the civilian military divide, the divide between those who served and those who hadn't. But I think that's a great illustrative point to say that those who have never served in combat may feel the anxiety and the trepidation that you felt before going to war. But I certainly recognize, and as you said, some veterans feel that way when leaving war. That old movie Apocalypse Now, right? When I was there, all I could think about was being here and getting back into the jungle.
And being there, yeah.
Right. And that's a challenge for all veterans, I think, to experience that, but also for those who never served to try to understand that. And it sounds like that you're doing a pretty good job, at least locally, to be able to bring that understanding to your community.
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, I don't know how much you know about everything that we do. You've obviously seen the documentary from The Guardian. But effectively what we've done, we created and it was actually in the, it came about, it went from being like once a week for 2 hours a night to a full-time project very quickly, because when these guys killed themselves, we wasn't sure if we could have made a difference to them if we had been a full-time project. Well, we felt definitely the guys had felt very isolated. Was one of the issues that they had, and we thought if we had a full-time project, would they have been able to come and engage with us? Would it have been different if we'd been full-time? So very quickly we took over a full-time project. We spoke to all the guys and girls coming through the door, said, what would you like to see? They said they would like a sort of a coffee shop stroke cafe that would be open to the public during the daytime, so that the public could see what we were doing and could also engage with the guys and girls and learn more about us, so they could have a better understanding of the veterans living within their community. We also, we get other agencies to come in that don't have offices local to us to do drop-in advice clinics for our guys and girls. And, at the moment, it seems to be working really well. Just when I left there today to come back to do a Skype call with you, I think we had about 20, 25 people in the cafe, a mixture of civilians and veterans, all engaging with each other, all talking. We had kids there. We've just taken over a large green area, so we've got some gardens now. We're going to be putting a gym into the gardens. We're going to be putting some working allotments, because the guys want to produce vegetables and work together to do that. So it's it seems to be going well, and by doing this, we've managed to get the local community to engage with us as well. So yesterday we had a load of school kids come down who have raised some money for us. We have local businesses come down to see what we're doing, and they learn from us because we're so open about our experiences and we're so open about the mental health side of things. They see that happening, so they ask us to give them advice, and I think we're making a difference locally anyway, Dwayne.
No, this is it's amazing to hear as we were talking and getting ready for the call over the past couple of weeks or so. I had the feeling, even from my past experience in talking to Matt Green, that which we have as similarities are much greater than that which we have our differences. And I've seen the same kind of thing here in the States, where veterans will come together and essentially take it in their own hands and say that, if no one else is going to do this for us, we need to do this for us. And again, it can be therapeutic with a little t, where it doesn't necessarily have to be therapy with a big T. Whereas I'm certain that when it does get to that point, you and your team are aware and then have the ability to connect the veteran to let's say, the next level of care with mental health.
Yeah, correct. Because and I'm going to use my area for an example, but there's no effective support where we live. Okay, so there's nothing geared up to support veterans and their families. So, and we're talking about a county here, which is, you guys call them a state, but this is a county-wide problem. So we put ourselves in a position, we're continuously learning daily, and we're testing and adjusting all the time, but we put ourselves in a position now where we're able to call upon other services if there's something that we know is beyond our scope of operations. So we can refer people to certain health services, we can refer people to certain charities. It takes a bit of a strain off them because they're not having to go through the hundreds of sort of assessment forms that they get sent. So we are making a difference. And throughout the country, actually, what you're seeing now is, in one shape or form or the other, you're seeing lots of veterans doing similar things. By doing this, we found out about other organisations, whether they work full time, whether they're working just once a week, twice a week, they're doing similar things. Not maybe with the same sort of spec as us. We've got a coffee shop and everything, but I know guys that organise weekly walks out over the hills and stuff up in the Brecons for guys and girls. We've got guys who organise fishing trips. We've got guys who just organise, gym sessions. Whatever it is, they're coming together to work together because there's no better support than, each other.
This puts me in mind of something that happened in the 80s here in the States, in which we have, as you said, the Department of Veterans Affairs, but there's also sort of a sub-organization as part of the Veterans Health Administration called our vet centers, which are essentially outpatient mental health counseling clinics, similar to the one that I work for in the civilian sector. But how the vet centers came about was Vietnam veterans finally looked around and said, well, our needs aren't being served. And so they gathered together and created these. Essentially, they're separate from the main VA. They're not in the VA hospitals. They're out in the communities. And it sounds like that's what you and other veterans, not just necessarily current era veterans, but other veterans are doing, again, to address these needs on our own, if they're not being addressed otherwise.
Yeah, that's it. It sounds like you guys are ahead of the game with that, actually. But that's essentially what we're doing here. So I was speaking to someone the other day from one of the sort of big charities over here, and she was the CEO of one of them. And I was saying to her, we're not here to tread on your toes, and we're not here to try to take away from what you guys are doing. We're here to complement you. So we're trying to take the pressure off of you, in the hopes that locally you can eventually provide a more efficient service for our veterans that we can't support ourselves. And going back just quickly, it's slightly off subject, I guess, but you've mentioned Vietnam a couple of times, and everyone, I think it's well known how the public perceived a lot of Vietnam veterans when they were coming back. How they perceived the war, and I've seen a couple of clippings as well. Footage of the kind of anger that your veterans faced when they were returning from Vietnam from the public, and that's another reason we do what we do now, because the only reason that anger exists is because people don't actually understand what we're doing, why we're there. We're not there necessarily because we want to be there. We're part of a system that sent us there to do a particular job, and people just don't understand that. So we have to learn to be more open. An example of that would be a few years ago, someone asked me, was I proud of the fact that I killed children? And I was trying to do kind of a part-time college course so I could improve myself. And I was asked this, it was a young lady. She said, "Are you proud of the fact you kill kids?" I've never killed a child in my life, as far as I'm aware. And I felt, even though that knocked me back, I felt this is maybe not even her fault. Yes, it was a bad question to ask. Yes, there was no need for her to ask that. But she's obviously got a misconception of what it is we do in the military. So the only way to change that is for us to actually educate and be more open about what it is we do and don't do.
No, I think that's outstanding. And from what I have seen through some of the research that I've done about the Veterans Hub and what you're doing, it definitely seems like that's the impact that you're making. And that's really what we're all trying to do, is just to be able to get those messages and those stories out there. So if somebody was interested, maybe, apparently I have a small following in the UK. But if someone in the UK is hearing about this for the first time and is interested in seeing what you're doing, or those in the US who are maybe interested in seeing what Veterans Hub is doing, how can they find you online?
Yeah, okay. So we're talk to anyone. We're happy to share everything we do with anyone. So the best way to get hold of us is over social media. We've got a Facebook account. We've got a Twitter account, but don't ask me about that because I don't really understand tech. But we do have a Facebook account, and it is just the Veterans Hub. And we've also, for the cafe we run, there's another one, the Veterans Hub Community Cafe. They're quite easy to find. I don't know if you're going to be able to show our logo at some point on your page. And yeah, if anyone's got any questions or they want to come and see the project or they want some information from us, all they've got to do is fire a message out to us and we'll get back to them.
No, I really appreciate that. I am definitely going to make sure that all of those links are in the show notes and then shared, like you said, across social media. Just to help is what you've said several times, is just the idea of veterans may feel as though they're isolated while they're really not, and spreading the word as much as we can literally, and what your goal and my goal is, to eventually save lives. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
It's fine. I mean, just, I know it's getting close to time to sign off now, but I just want to say, Dwayne, one, it's been really good talking to you, but the other thing is, and it's not as simple as this, I know, it's easy for me to say this, and, I know it's not as simple as this, but the fact is, however we've served, wherever we've been, whatever we've done, there's nothing we can do to change that. It is what it is. Yeah. We're lucky to be here, and yes, we do feel isolated when we come out, but the fact is, if you're in a battalion and you've got all them people around you when you're in, well, all them people are outside as well, and all we've got to do is reach out, and that's it, because, there's more people than what you realise going through the same things, and they're questioning themselves and they've got the same guilt trips, but, we can't change it. It's happened. We need to test, readjust. We need to move on and make something of ourselves, because, I've lost one too many friends. And I'm sure, even though I can't help the way I feel at times, I'm sure they wouldn't want to see me feeling like this. Okay, they want me to create a life for myself, and that's what we're trying to do here. And if we only help one person, if we only change the life of one person, then as far as I'm concerned, we've all achieved something.
No, that's absolutely the truth. And, and sometimes we might talk about that, whether it's cliche, we may say that, but do we really mean it? But it's actually true. If only
it is
right.
True.
And if only one person, if one veteran, whether UK or Canadian or, interestingly enough, there's a lot of Ukrainian veterans who are, who are emerging into this. I've actually had someone who was at the embassy in Egypt, where a lot of the Egyptian military is starting to struggle with these things. So if any one veteran anywhere listens to this conversation and decides to reach out to somebody, then I think your time and my time was well spent.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, look, and just for an interest point for you, it's the same in Germany as well. I've got German family now. And I was over there and I bumped into a guy who had served in Afghanistan as well. And, the similarities between what you and me have talked about and what they're going through. Yeah, arguably they're going through worse times than us, because there is no recognition of anything over there at all. And it was just wherever you go, it's across the board. And the point is, we can help each other, we can support each other, we can't change what's happened. There was a guy the other day came into me and he's traumatized by an incident in Northern Ireland where he killed a guy. And he suffers this massive guilt complex from it. And yes, it's not a nice thing. Yes, we would all like to avoid killing people if we could. But the point is, it wasn't his fault. That's what I was trying to say to him. You feel like it was, but actually you were put into that situation, and it was a situation of you being killed or injured, or one of your colleagues being killed or injured, or you killing this guy or injuring this guy. And we're all in exactly the same situation. There's no one to blame. It's a job we're sent to do. And it's just coming to terms with that and learning how to move on from that. Nothing can make a difference. It's done.
Truer words were never spoken, my friend.
Yeah. So there you go. But this has been good, Wayne. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you coming on the show as well. Definitely going to try to let as many people know about what you're doing as possible, in trying to share this so that, like you said, that veterans can realize that we're not alone.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. Does that sound familiar? Much of what Andy talks about is the same thing that U.S. veterans experience. From being told we're not equipped to deal with veterans to being asked what it's like to kill, there appear to be experiences that are common amongst all former service members. Andy's responses to these challenges is similar to that of many other veterans: to pick up a shovel and help their fellow veterans the best way they can. The Veterans Hub is essentially a social enterprise, an organization that uses commercial and business practices to make a social impact. We've talked about the benefits of peer support before on the show, and Andy's making an effort to use these benefits for the improvement of his fellow soldiers. Even through all of this, things aren't always the greatest. Andy talks about how he's recently had a setback when it comes to mental health, and that's going to happen with all veterans. Some major, some minor, but you don't go to combat and come back completely unscathed. But the trick is to acknowledge when things are getting rough again, address the problem, and pick back up and get into the fight. Hopefully Andy's story is one that can resonate with service members, veterans, and their families, and those who support them. The more we hear the common stories, the easier it is to tell our own. Thanks for taking the time to check us out. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST095. While you're there, share the link to the show with somebody that you think may enjoy it. One of the challenges in changing the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health is how do we spread the word? You can subscribe in a bunch of different podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and many others. Check everywhere you can hear us at veteranmentalhealth.com/platforms. If the player you listen to podcasts on isn't there, then let me know and I'll figure out how to get there. While you're checking it out, consider dropping a rating or review on the show. It helps for the show to rank higher in searches. A colleague and friend of mine who's a guest on an upcoming show mentioned to me that I probably don't know half of the people who are impacted the show, and that's for sure. I want to give a shout out to a Twitter follower, Gigi Griffith, who sent a great message of encouragement. If we don't get that kind of feedback, then we don't know how we're doing. You can find out how to share the same feedback on the podcast player you use by going to www.veteranmentalhealth.com/platforms. We have another way for you to give feedback too. After nearly 2 years of running this circus on my own, I got somebody to help me out. Doc Johnson, a former Army medic, has agreed to help me wrangle this mess. You can get a message to me and her by dropping an email to info@veteranmentalhealth.com. One more thing. Just a reminder that the guests and information in this show are for educational purposes only. It's not meant to be considered professional advice. While I am a clinical mental health counselor, I am not your therapist. If something you've heard on the show makes you think that you need to talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us next week for another great episode, and until then, remember veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic Tennessee, embrace my ability.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life so demanding, so much pain unexplaining. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
That every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life so demanding, so much pain unexplaining.
rise. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith.